Hey guys, Spencer here. I'm going to give my presentation via this video because I can't attend class tonight, unfortunately. So I'm going to be doing my presentation about this guy. His name is Jacob Riis, Jacobriis. He was born May 3rd, 1849 and died May 26th in 1914. So Jacob was a social documentary photographer, most known for his work with photography and journalism about the poor people in New York City. So these impoverished New Yorkers were the subject of most of his writings and photography throughout his career. He is considered one of the fathers of photography because he discovered the use of flash. And while he lived in New York City, he experienced poverty and became a police reporter writing about the quality of life in the slums. Jacob Riis had been writing about the conditions in New York City, and he couldn't get it out. He couldn't show people what he wanted to say with what he was writing about, so he tried sketching. And sketching didn't really work for him. He was a very good artist. And camera lenses in the 1880s were slow, particularly in the depth of field, because they were heavy and bulky and photography just wasn't at its top peak then. So using photography wasn't really going to work for what he wanted to show in the dark interiors and the bad living conditions in New York. So in 1887, Riis read an article that said there had been a way to take a picture using a flashlight, so the darkest corners of a room may be lit up so it can be photographed. It was a German innovation made by Adolf Meith, I think that's how you pronounce that word, and it was to mix magnesium with potassium chlorate, two chemicals together in kind of a pistol-like thing where you would shoot it at the same time you were taking the picture, and it would light up the room and you could snap your picture. Thus, the introduction of flash photography. One of Jacob Riis's favorite things to photograph was houses or living conditions, because that's what he wanted to show everyone in New York City. So this picture that's up right now is a house on Bleecker Street between Mercer and Green Streets. And this house is almost toppling into an excavation site. We can assume that there are people living in this house. So it is inhabited by people, and this is where they sleep and they stay. So Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. And it was just a collection of his photographs of New York City at that time about living conditions and poverty. The picture that I have up now is one called 5 Cents a Spot. And it's really about the deprivation on the men and women and children and little babies of New York City in 1889. And for almost 40 years, Jacob Riis photographed these things, and it had an emotional impact on him. This next picture that I am going to be displaying is one of particular interest to me because it's a little different than the normal Riis photographs, because it's more of an overview. So it shows the hustle and bustle. It's called The Bend, and it's of New York's Chinatown. Particularly Riis's photographs focused on an individual or a certain event, but this one just shows the whole entirety of the photograph, and there's lots more emotion in it. This picture that I'm showing now is one called Sleeping Children in Mulberry Street. And, the picture has actual children sleeping in like a drain on Mulberry Street, and it portrays sadness and depression and just shows how bad the actual living conditions were. I mean, this is what he dedicated his life work to, and it made an impact on people. He wrote in his articles and books about how terrible living conditions were, and the tenants who lived in these houses were really pretty much saved by his writings, because the landlords would be exposed to how they were treating their tenants. So he really created lots of controversy with his photographs. This last picture that I'm showing you is one that has children working in a factory. And this really gives you the impression of life in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where children actually had to work and help pay for their houses, and most of the people living in New York time didn't even have a house. Like the last picture that I showed you, where the kids were sleeping in a drain, or they were sleeping in the streets, or people lived in cardboard boxes in the streets. And this picture shows that, and it really got people thinking about how people lived. So to wrap up my presentation here, I just wanted to say that, you know, Riis was a very brilliant photographer, and because so much of his work was done at night, he was able to capture the worst elements of the New York slums and the dark streets, and the tenant apartments and all of that stuff faced by the poor and the criminal, and in the vicinity of the notorious Mulberry Street. So now, in conclusion, my presentation over Jacob Riis is done. I hope you learned something, and I hope that this counts to whatever credentials that you were hoping for, Bev. So see you guys when I get back to class.